Tonight, we're going to do an overview of Philippians.
今天都要做腓立比书的概览。
And this is so that those of you guys who are teaching, you have the same basic foundation.
希望每个教导的人都有同一个背景。
So when you're preparing your teaching, you're working with the same thinking.
所以在预备讲道的时候，都有同一种背景的了解了。
You know, I love Philippians.
我非常爱腓立比书。
It's one of my favorite books in the
我
Bible.
实在圣经最喜欢之一的一卷书。
It is Paul's, I think, most. You can just see he loves the people.
就感受到保罗非常爱腓立比人。
So he doesn't speak harshly. He doesn't speak anything. You need to get this right. He doesn't
所
do
以
that.
他没有什么纠正，也没有什么要劝他们怎么样了。
So I like that part.
我很喜欢这一个
But
部分。
also, there's some amazing scriptures in
腓立
Philippians.
比书里也很多很棒的经节。
I've got 2 life scriptures in my life.
我的生命里面2个重要的，对我个人生命的2个经节。
One of them is from Philippians chapter 3, verses 7 to 11.
一个是腓立比书第3章第7到第11节。
That was the first life verse I ever got.
这个是以前我觉得神给我的生命、我的人生的一个经节。
And then there's another scripture I just think is absolutely amazing. It's from Philippians chapter 2.
还有另外一个经节，我觉得非常奇妙，就是第
I
2
think
章
it's from verse 3 to verse 8.
3到第8节。
It's some of the things that Paul writes are they're just outstanding.
就是写这个非常奇妙的、
Extremely deep.
非常深奥的。
But you realize if I can understand these things, it'll change my life.
如果我可以了解这些经节，这个会翻转我的
So I
生命。
love Philippians.
所以我非常爱腓立比
Listen,
书。
for us to do an introduction tonight,
今天晚上也要做一个介绍这卷书。
we're going to look at the 3 main areas that we always look at when you're studying a book.
所以每次我们要读一卷书，好像就有3个部分要看。
We're going to look at the author.
我们要看到作者、
We're going to look at the recipients of the letter.
收信者，
And then we're going to look at the purposes of the
还有
letter.
我们要看到写这封信的目标。
Now, of course, we're going to start with the author.
所以先要从作者开始。
Now, I warn you, I've got a lot to say about the author.
我要先警告你们一下，我真的很多话要说。
As you listen to me tonight and you realize, man, he's going a long time on the author.
哇，你们说这怎么一直讲
We're
作者了？
not going to finish till 11 o'clock
好像我们
tonight.
晚上11点才有办法
I
结
just
束，
let your hearts be at peace.
所以心里要预备好。
Because this first section is by far the
所以
longest
第一
section.
个就有关作者是最长的，所以不用太担心。
Now, I started counting
我开
when I
始
was
数，
preparing.
我在预备的时候我开始数，
And I counted the words for Paul.
我就数有提到保罗、
Paul, I,
我、
me,
我的、
my.
我的，
Yeah, there's different words in
英
English
文有
on
不
this.
一样的。
Okay, but these are all, every time that Paul referred to himself,
每次保罗写一些有关他自己的，
and he refers to himself 127 times in these 4 chapters.
我就是127次有谈到，对，127次是谈到保罗，对。
And I counted the times Paul referred to him, the number of times Paul refers to himself in a few other books.
所以我就开始数别的保罗写的书信，
So I took the book of
比
Colossians
方说格罗西书、
and Ephesians.
以弗所书，
They were written about the same time as
他
Philippians.
写的跟腓立比书差不多同一个时候。
And then 1 Thessalonians to 2
还有帖撒
Thessalonians.
罗尼迦前书、帖撒罗尼
And
迦
I
后
took
书。
all 4 of those letters
我把这4卷书的里面，
and I counted all the times Paul refers to himself in all 4 of those letters.
我就数保罗在这4卷书总共加起来的，他谈到他自
And
己
he
有
only
多少。
refers to himself 74 times
在这
in
4
all
卷，
4.
所有4卷加起来只有74次。
So something is special about
所以
Philippians.
腓立比书真的有一些特别的。
There are 104 verses in the book of Philippians.
有腓立比书总共有104个经节，
And in 52 of those verses,
所以104当中的52个经节，
Yeah, okay, 52. Paul reveals something about himself.
保罗有写一点有关着自己。
But in almost half of the verses in Philippians, he's talking about himself.
所以实在是腓立比书的差不多一半的经节都谈
These
到
are
他
like
自己。
glimpses of his life
好
he's
像
giving
他
to
的
these
生命、
people.
他的生平，我们可以让我们了解，
Maybe something from his history,
可能是从他的历史，
or his past
还是
circumstances,
他过去的
or
环境
his，present
还是他
circumstances,
现在的环
or
境，
his relationships,
还是他的人际关
his
系，
attitudes,
他的态度，
his vision,
他的意向，
his values.
他的价值观。
Why did I do all this counting?
为什么我数这么多
What？does all this mean?
这个是什么意义？
If you want to understand Philippians,
有时候你要了解腓立比书，
you need to understand Paul,
你需要更了解保罗，
because there's so much where he's revealing
因为
himself.
保
in this
罗
book.
很多他让我们看到他是怎么样的一
So
个
so
人。
let's talk about Paul.
所以我们来
Now-
谈保罗。
Chances are most of you guys already have this information.
我相信你们大部分的可能已经有这个了解，
You've heard
有关
it
保罗
before.
你们以前听过，
And some of you may know more than I do
甚至你
about
们
Paul.
了解有关保罗的比我还要多。
Some of you though, maybe you haven't done a lot of study on
可能
Paul.
有的还没有很多的研究有关
But
保
I
罗
want to。tell you, no matter where you are, whether you know a lot about
无论
Paul
你
or
了解
not
很
very
多
much,
还是不了解很多，
just try to add a little bit tonight.
试试看，真正增加一点对保罗的认识。
Okay, just put a little bit in your brain
把
that'll help you to
增加在你
understand
的
what's
思
going
考
on.
里面，更多的帮助你了解保罗。
You know, Paul was born about 1 AD.
保罗大概是西元后第一年出生，
This, first of all, it makes him just a little bit younger than
就
Jesus.
是比耶稣年轻一点点。
He was born in the city of
他
Tarsus.
是在大树出生，
He was born to very Jewish, zealous Jewish parents.
他的父母亲是很火热的犹太教的，
His father was a Pharisee,
他的父亲是法利赛
and
人，
his parents, his family were Roman citizens.
所以他的父母亲是罗马国民。
I don't know how they got their Roman
我们不
citizenship.
晓得他们怎么变罗马国民，
Maybe they bought it.
可能他们用钱买的，
Maybe they earned it.
可能他们是赚来的，
Maybe it was a reward.
可能是一个奖赏。
But when Paul was born,
可是保罗出生的时候，
he automatically became a Roman
他
citizen.
就马上就成为罗马帝国的
He
人，
didn't have to earn his
他不需要
citizenship.
赚来的。
And it's important that you remember this idea.
所以记得这个观念，就是他是从一出生就是罗马帝国的国
Because
民，
throughout this whole story of Paul's life,
因为在保罗的整个故事，
you're going to hear about this
你会
idea.
听到这个观念。他说
Now, when Paul was, by the way, when Paul was born, he was given 2 names.
所以保罗出生的时候，他大概有2个名字
The
了。
first one was his Latin name.
第一个是他的拉丁文的名字，
That was Paul.
这是保罗。
Now, Tarsus was in the middle of Gentile territory. It was a Roman city.
所以大叔是在外邦人的地区，是一个罗马城
A
市，
lot of Greek culture.
很多的希腊的文化。
And so Paul needed a Latin name.
所以保罗需要一个拉丁文的名字。
But of course, as a Jewish family, he also had a Hebrew
可
name.
是他有一个希伯来的名字了，
And that's the name Saul.
就是扫罗。
And sometimes we think that after he got saved, he changed his name from Saul to Paul.
有时候我们觉得他得救以后，好像他把名字从扫罗改到保罗，
That's not true.
好像不是这样子
He
的。
always had those 2
他好
names.
像一直就有这2个
It's
名
just
字
that
了。
he changed his name when he began to go out in missions to the
可是
Gentiles.
对外邦人开始做宣讲，他就改到保罗，
All right.
因为是拉丁文的。
So when Paul was 13 years old, about 13 years old,
保罗差不多13岁的时候，
he was sent to Jerusalem to have special education.
他就被派到耶路撒冷有特别的教育。
And he was being trained, he was under the training of a teacher named Gamaliel.
他的老师的名字叫做加马列，
He very famous teacher of that time.
当时很有名的一个老师。
And Paul was training, Paul was wanting to be a Pharisee, of course.
保罗
Like his family.
他想要做法利赛
But he
人，
was
跟他的家人一
but
样
he。was training to become a rabbi.
所以，可是他在那里是受训，是要做一个拉比。
And a rabbi was like part teacher and part lawyer.
一个拉比，当时的拉比是部分的是传道人，部分的是律师。
Can you see that in Paul's writing?
你在保罗的书信里面可以看到这个部分的传道，部分的律师。
In a couple of his books, he writes like a lawyer.
有时候在书信里面写得像一个律师一样。
In the book of Romans, he is making his case.
在罗马书，譬如说罗马书，他写得非常清楚，
And
要
he's brilliant.
辨明他非常聪明的来
So
解
you
释。
see his training here.
所以你就可以看到他的卓越的训练。
In Acts chapter 17,
在使徒行传第17章，
you have Paul in Athens.
保罗在雅典，
And he's speaking before all these
他
philosophers.
在那个哲学家前
You
面是
see
讲
his
到，
lawyer
你
training.
就可以在这里也是可以看到他的法律
He's
系的
using
这种逻辑的。
He's using logic
它是属于
to
一个很强的一个
make
逻
his
辑
point.
来跟他们
He's brilliant in these
是
places.
非常的卓越，非常的聪明。
His goal in being educated,
他在这样是被受这个教育的目
his
标，
his main goal, what he wanted to become
他
someday.
主要的是有一天想要达到什
He
么呢？
wanted to become a member of the Sanhedrin.
当时他希望他可以成为犹太人公会的一份子。
Now, the Sanhedrin was like it was a council of the top Jewish leaders.
当时的公会就是犹太人最高凌层的一些领导者。
It was like, I don't know, it was like the Supreme Court.
好像那个
That's
耶路撒冷的那个犹太人的公会，就是像最高法
That's
院。
what they had, and
高等法院。
there were 72 of these people on the
所以
Sanhedrin
这个公会里面有
in
在
Jerusalem.
耶路撒冷有72个人，
And Paul wanted to be on that.
保罗就希望是当一个成员，
So he was getting educated.
所以他受到这个教育，
When
为
he
了达到
when
这
he
个。
turned about 20 years old,
他差不多20岁的时候，
that part of his education was finished.
他的这个教育的部分就结束了。
But for him to become a rabbi,
可是他要成为一个拉比，
he needed to go and learn a trade.
他需要先去学一个技巧，一个技能。
So
可以
he went back to his hometown of Tarsus, back to where his family
所以
was.
他回去他的家人
And you know what
大
job?
树。
And you know what job his family had?
后来他的家人大概教什么工作？制帐篷。
That's right. That's right. They were tent makers.
因为他们是制帐篷，
And so now Paul had to learn how to be a tent
所以现
maker.
在保罗也是要学怎么样用这个来养活自己。
So he spent the next 10 years learning how to do
所以
that.
之后的10年，他就来学制帐篷。
When he was 30 years old,
30岁的时候，
he returned back down to Jerusalem.
他就回耶路撒冷，
He was pursuing his rabbi goal.
在追求这个做拉比的目标。
Now, I believe that Paul was probably married at this time.
我相信在那个时候，可能保罗结婚，
And I'm guessing he also had children.
相信也是他可能有孩子了。
I mean, of course, I can be wrong on this.
这个有可能我错了，这个完全是
But
猜
we
测。
know that if he wanted to be a member of the Sanhedrin,
如果他想要成为犹太人的公会的一份子，
he had to be married.
他一定要结婚，
He needed to have children.
他需要有小孩。
30 was old for Israel for getting married and having
当时
children.
30岁的时候才生孩子是很老，
So I'm guessing that he was married.
所以我猜他那时候已经结婚了。
And I'm guessing that after he got saved, his wife and children, his whole family just left him.
我猜他得救之后，他的家人完全离开他。
Okay. So right about this time,
所以在这个时候，
early 30s,
30出头，
Paul was like a rising star in the Jewish leadership.
他就是好像一直快起，很 浮起的一种明星，在犹太人的当中，
People could see him and see how amazing he
人家
was.
可以看到他多厉害，
His brilliance, the way his
他的
intelligence.
聪明，
And so they had their eye on him.
所以他们也是很注意到
And they
这个
begin-
新的明星，
And they began to give him greater and greater
所以开始
responsibilities.
给他们越来越大的责任。
And one of the first responsibilities they gave
所以
him
他给他一个很大的一个责任，
was to go and find this cult of Christians that was growing in all of Israel.
就是找这个异端，他们当时觉得是一个异端，就是基督徒一直在以色列人，
And
以色列一直起来，
And so Paul, he was zealous
所以
in
保罗
this.
很火热，要
He took his responsibility
很尽责
seriously.
任，在
And
这
he
个
started hunting down Christians.
他就开始追哪里有基督徒，
He would get them arrested,
才会逮捕他们，
and then he would try them. He'd put them on
后
trial.
来会让他们上法院。
And remember, he was a lawyer.
记得他是律师，
Of course, it's probably during this time he heard a lot of stories about Jesus.
可能在这个时候就开始听很多耶稣的故事，
Because when he was putting these Christians on trial, they would share their
因为他们
testimony.
上这些基督徒要上法院的时候，他们都一直会讲见
So
证。
now he's going after the Christians.
所以现在在追基督徒了，
Some of these Christians were even put to death.
有的
that
基
he
督徒甚至被杀。
One day, his leaders gave him an assignment.
有一天，他的领导的给他一个任务，
He said, they said, we've heard of these Christians that are up in Damascus.
我们听说大马色有一些基督徒，
And so we want you to go find them.
我们希望你要去那里来
And we
找
want
他们，
we want you to punish them.
我们要你惩罚他们。
So you guys know the story.
所以你们就知道这个故事了。
He's going to Damascus.
他去大马色，
Jesus appears to him.
耶稣在路上向他显
He
现，
gets saved.
他得救了。
Jesus gives him his mission in life.
后来耶稣给他的生命的命
And
定，
Paul is completely changed.
还有保罗完全的被翻转。
Now, of course, everybody hated him now,
现在每一个人都恨保罗
right? The Jews hated him,
犹太人甚至也恨他，
and the Christians feared him.
基督徒本来就很
So
怕
he
他，
was in a tough place.
所以这现在是在一个很辛苦的位置。
The next 13 years, you see Paul going several different places.
未来的13年，看到保罗的去
It
很
was,
多不同
it
的
was
地
a
方，
time of him growing in Jesus.
是一个他在耶稣里面成长
But
的
it
一
was
个时间。
also a time where he went back to his hometown of Tarsus,
可是一个时间，他是回去
And
他的家乡的大树，
and he learned about Greek culture.
他也在这个时候学到希腊人的文化，
And so, because he knew he would need this.
因为他知道以后他需要了解希腊
After
文化。
those 13 years,
在这13年之后，
a guy named Barnabas came and found him
后来有一个弟兄叫做巴拿巴
and took Paul
来
back
找
to
他，
the city of Antioch.
后来把保罗带回去一个城市叫做安提亚。
In Antioch, there was a thriving Gentile church.
安提亚那边就有新开始的一个外邦人的一个非常火热的教会，
And Barnabas needed Paul's help.
还有巴拿巴他需要保罗的
So
帮
they
助，
began to work in this Gentile
所以
church.
他们就开始在这个外邦
These
人
are
的教会，
obviously Gentiles who became
就是
Christians.
外邦人成为基督徒。
After a time, the leaders of that church in Antioch, they sent Paul and Barnabas out to go do missionary work among the Gentiles.
所以在这个时候，有过了一阵子，他们这个教会就差派保罗跟巴拿巴去宣教。
So what we're going to talk about right now are Paul's missionary journeys.
所以现在我们就开始谈到保罗的宣教旅程。
I know there's a lot of details in this,
我觉得这里面也很多的细
but I'm
节。
pretty sure almost everything I'm going to share with you tonight you can use in your study of your understanding of
可
Philippians.
是我相信今天晚上我分享的，你会使用，对腓立比书有更深的了解。
Now, Paul went on 3 missionary journeys.
所以保罗去3次宣教旅
They were
程，
a total of 10 years.
所以时间差不多10年。
Sometimes we think it's much longer that
有时候
Paul
我
was
们觉得好
out
像
there.
更久
And
了，
that's because it takes us a long time to read about
因为
him.
我们读的好像读了好久才读
But
完
it was
了。
only 10 years.
可是只有10
It
年，
was from 47 to 57
就是
AD.
47西元后47年到57年了。
I like that Paul was born in 1 AD
我很喜欢保罗是西元后第1年出生的，
because then it's easy to figure out how old he is,
你就很容易了解他几岁。
right? So he was about 46, 47 years old when he became a missionary
他
for the
成
first
为
time.
第一次成为宣教师，他差不多46岁，
How many of you guys are younger than
现在还
47
没
years
有
old?
46岁的。
Let's see those hands.
啊，
Younger
我
than
来看还
47.
没有46岁的，啊，我们看这些手了。
Yeah, but Paul
保
was
罗的弟弟不敢举手。
yeah, I was wondering about that, but you 57 years old, right? Yeah.
你57岁，对不对？
And Paul was kind of old to become a missionary.
所以46岁实在保罗有一点年
I
长
mean,
才开始。
really, I don't think people lived that long back
好
then.
像以前人家也不一定很长寿
And，he's stepping out in this.
可是他现在在这个年龄就插
Paul's
出来。
main goals in his missionary journeys.
所以保罗的主要目标在他每次他宣教旅程主要的目标，
The main one is he wanted to start churches in the Gentile areas.
就想在外邦人的地区开拓教会。
And then he wanted to help those churches grow.
后来要帮助这些教会成长，
It was that simple.
就是这么的简单。
Start churches
开拓教会，
and help them to grow,
后来帮助
grow
这些
strong.
教会成长变
Now,
得强
during
壮。
those 10 years, he stayed in many different places.
所以在这10年，他去很多不同的地
But
方，
there were also different lengths of time.
可是也有不同的时间，它不是每一个地方时间都是一样长。
The shortest time that he spent in one place was maybe 2 to 3 weeks.
可能最短的就是2-3个礼拜，
The longest time he spent was maybe 2.5 years,
最长的是2年半，
close to 3 years.
靠近3年。
And Paul's strategy was almost always the same.
保罗的策略几乎都是一样的。
Do you remember what it
你
is?
们记得策略是
What
什
was
么？
his main strategy for planting a church?
他每次开拓一个教会，他用什么策略？
Among the Gentiles,
就是要在外邦人的当中开拓教会。
what's the first thing he would do when he would go into a
他
city?
去一个城市，他做的第一件事情是什么？哎，问
Yep,
这个。
that's right. He always went to the. If there was a
犹太人的会堂。
synagogue, if there was a synagogue, he went there first.
如果有会堂，他就先会去那里。
And it's not just because he loved Jews more.
不是因为他比较爱犹太人，
It was actually very smart strategy
是很聪明的一个策略，
because the Jews had a background.
因为他们有一点背景，
They understood the law and the prophets.
他们了解律法，他们了解先知。
Paul was an expert in the law and the
那
prophets.
保罗这是在律法法律还有先知，就是非常专业。
And so it would be much easier for Jews to understand the gospel than Gentiles who had these crazy religions.
所以犹太人比较容易了解信仰，那些外邦人他们有一些疯狂的宗教比较难。
So he would go into a synagogue
进
first,
去先犹太人的会堂，
and usually he would get kicked out after a little bit.
经常过了一阵子才会被踢出去了。
And then he would go and start sharing in the Gentile
后来
community.
才会去在外邦人的社区里面，
By the way, he might also have been following a little bit of what Jesus did,
可能才有一点像耶稣所做的。
where it says Jesus went to the Jew first and then to the
耶
Gentile.
稣先去犹太人，后来去外邦人，
Okay, so that may have been
可能这个也是影
what
响他
happened。too. So Paul's first missionary journey.
所以保罗的第一个宣教旅
It
程
lasted about 2 years,
差不多2年，
47 to 48 AD.
47、48。
Paul and Barnabas, they had another companion named John Mark that was with them at this
所
time.
以保罗跟巴拿巴有另外一个伙伴叫做约翰马可，
And their goal was to go to Galatia and start churches among in the region of Galatia.
他们想要在加拉太这个地区里面分享福音。
And I have to say, they went the long way.
他们的旅程是有一点好像走得很长的。
Yeah, I mean, listen,
Listen.
listen. Antioch is not very far from Tarsus,
安提亚蛮靠近大树
and，Tarsus is just just kind of a short way away from all these places that they would go in
还有
Galatia.
大树非常靠近加拉太，他们要去的。
But for some reason, they wanted to sail,
可是他们莫名其妙就先坐船到
and they went first to the island of Cyprus,
到那个岛塞浦路斯，
and then they went up to the
后来从那里
southern coast of
后
Galatia.
来飞到加拉太，就是坐船到加拉太的那
Not
个。
long after that, John Mark says, "No, no, no, too tough for me," or
后来
something.
约
and
翰
he
马可
went-
说：“
he
没有，
went
这个
home.
太辛苦，我不要跟你们一起了。
And so now it's Paul and Barnabas.
所以
They really visited 4 basic cities in
所以
Galatia.
保罗跟巴拿巴在这个宣教旅程拜访主要的是4个城市，
And there was amazing fruit.
还有奇妙的，很
They
快就
saw,
结果子
they。saw a lot of people get saved.
他们看到很多人得救，
They saw a lot of miracles
他们
happen.
看到很多的神迹奇事。
They saw churches get started in each of those
他们这
places.
4个城市都看到有教会
Something
开拓，
wonderful was happening.
奇妙的事情发生。
But it was also a really, really hard time for Paul.
也是对保罗很辛苦的一段时
A
间，
lot of persecution.
很多的逼迫。
He was beaten with rods.
他们是用棍子打
He
他，
had a lot of death threats.
他们恐吓要杀死他。
One time he was stoned and left for
一
dead.
次用石头打死他，他们以为死了。
I mean, they stoned him, they threw stones at him so hard that they thought he was dead.
他们用石头那么用力用石头打死他，
And
以
then
为他真的死了。
everybody left Paul.
后来大家都离开了保
And
罗
then，Paul stood up and walked back
后来
into the
保罗
city.
还是站起来走回去这个城市。
But Paul suffered during that
可
time.
是保罗在这个时间里面真的也是受苦，
And he probably was not in great shape to begin with.
所以不一定他的身体一开始就是这么健
Because I
康。
think before that he had been beaten by the Jews, whipped by the Jews several
因为
times.
之前好像我们也体会到他是被犹太人鞭打了，
So at the end of their time,
所以他们的这个第一次宣教旅程最后的时间，
Paul and Barnabas, they returned to these 4 cities, the churches that they'd started,
保罗跟巴拿巴又回去他们4个城市，他们
just
所
to
开拓教会
encourage the churches.
来鼓励他们。
And then they sailed back
后
home
来又
to
坐船
Antioch.
回去到安提亚。
All right, when they got back to Antioch,
到了安提亚，
they took a 2-year rest.
好像在那里休息了2年了，
Again, I think part of it might have been Paul's health.
说不定是保罗的身体。
But during that time,
可是在这段时间，
Paul began to hear back from Galatia, the churches in Galatia, that the Jewish Christians were coming and telling them they had to become Jews if they wanted to be Christians.
所以他在安提亚的时候，开始有一些人传话给他说，现在加拉太这些地区的教会，就是有犹太的基督徒去他们那里说，你们一定要成为先成为犹太人，之后才可以成为基督徒。
And we call those those Jewish Christians that tried to tell the Gentiles that, we call them Judaizers.
所以这种基督徒就是犹太人的基督徒，要强逼外邦人成为犹太人才可以成为基督徒。
It's an important idea that you know this was an enemy of Paul's.
就是你知道这个是保罗的敌人，就是那些犹太基督徒强
And so
迫外
when
邦
Paul
人去。
heard what these Jewish Christians were doing,
所以当保罗听到这些犹太基督徒所做的，
he wrote a letter to the Galatian church,
他就
the
写信
churches.
给加拉太的教会，
And it's his letter to the Galatians.
这是他写给加拉太的。
And
So-
that's a tough letter.
如果你们看加拉太书，这个是很硬
You
的，
can feel Paul's
你感觉到
anger with what these
保罗的怒气，
Jewish Christians were
就是那
doing.
些犹太的基督徒所做的事情了。
Right? Now, I want you to understand, because I know we don't have the right word here. Not all Jewish Christians were like this.
不是所有的犹太基督徒是这样子
That's
的，
why we have a different word for them.
这是为什么有另外一个
I am
字，
going to use the English word, and you're going to remember
我
the
会
English
用
word
那个
on
英文
this,
字，
okay?
你们就会记得。
We'll figure out another word later.
我们最后
Okay?
会找出来这个字。
That was also a time that during that 2 years where the Jerusalem Council met.
我们在这2年了，就是保罗在安提亚的那2，也是我们有耶路撒冷会议。
Do you guys remember that?
你们记得耶路撒冷会议
Acts chapter 15.
使徒行传第15
This
章，
was huge for the Apostle
这
Paul.
个是对保罗非常重要的一
And,
个会
and,
议。
and it was when the church in Jerusalem, the council, the leaders of the church in Jerusalem, they decided that the Gentiles did not have to become Jewish in order to be saved.
所以这个会议就是使徒行传第15章，是一个非常重要的，就是当时的犹太的基督徒决定说，我们不需要要求人要先成为犹太人才信耶稣了。
The Gentiles didn't have to get circumcised.
所以，譬如说，基督徒外邦的基督徒不需要隔离，
They didn't have to keep the food laws.
他们不需要守那些饮食的规定，
They didn't have to go and attend all of the festivals that
他们不
Jews
需
were
要参
required.
加犹太人所有的节庆，
They did not have to become Jewish.
他们不需要成为犹太人。
And so the church leader
所以这个
wrote a letter saying that.
所以当时的教会的领导就写一封信说这个，
Paul went away with that letter.
后来保罗就离开了有
It
这
was a
封信，
very important time.
非常重要的一个时刻。
All right. So now we get to the second missionary journey.
所以我们现在到了第二个宣教旅程。
Paul and Barnabas have had 2 years of rest.
现在保罗跟巴拿巴已经休息2年了。
This missionary journey lasted from 50 to 52 AD.
这个是50到52年。
Paul and Barnabas were no longer a team.
保罗跟巴拿巴不再是一个团队。
They had a difference. They had a disagreement about John Mark.
有一个分裂是因为约翰马可。
And so Paul had a new teammate named Silas.
所以保罗就有一个新的伙伴叫做
And
希腊。
he and Silas decided we're going to go back to Galatia.
所以保罗跟希腊决定，我们要回去加拉太。
That's how we're going to start our
我们的宣教旅程
And we're
要
going
这样
to
子
go
了。
visit all of these 4 churches that
我
were
们要
there.
去拜访我们上一次所开拓的那4
And
间
it
教
says they
会，
took that letter and they showed it to each of the
他们
churches.
就拿了那封信去拜访每一间教会。
That said you do not have to become Jewish
就
in
是
order
说
to become，a
你不
Christian.
需要成为犹太人，你才可以成
So
为基督徒。
they encouraged the churches there.
他们就鼓励当地的教会。
When they were in the city of Lystra,
他们是在路斯德的时候，
they had another young man join their team.
有一个年轻的信徒加入他们的团队。
Who was that?
这是谁？
That's right,
提
Timothy.
摩太。对，
That's right. And so Paul had met Timothy before,
之前保罗已经遇见提摩太，
and now Timothy wanted to join
所以
Paul and Silas.
现
in
在
what
提
they
摩
were
太
doing.
想要加入这个希腊跟保罗这个
And this
团
was the
队。
start of an amazing, like father-son
这个是
relationship.
很奇妙的一个父亲跟儿子的关系。
So after they traveled through Galatia,
所以他们就在加拉太。
Paul kind of had a heart. He wanted to go to the region of Asia.
他很想要去一个地区叫做亚细亚。
That's different than, okay, all right. And that included Ephesus.
这个包括以弗所。
But God said, no, I don't want you to go there
神
right
说
now.
我不要你去那里了，
So they just kept moving north
所以一直往北的方向去，
until they got to the city of Troas.
一直到一个城市叫做 Troas， 就是靠海边。
And that's when God gave them further direction on where they should go.
后来在这里，神给他更清楚的一
He
个
called them
说
to-
明要去哪
He
里。
called them to go to
他
Macedonia.
说我要你们去马其顿。
Now, who did they meet in Troas?
他们在叫什么地方？特罗亚遇见谁？
He became a team member,
也变成他们的团队的一个队员，
wrote the book of Acts.
写了《使徒行传》路加。对，
Yeah, they met Luke. He was Dr. Luke.
他们遇见路加医生。
I'm sorry, I don't know where Luke came from.
我不晓得路加哪里
I
来。
read something that said he actually came, they think he came from Antioch.
有人说他可能原来是安提亚来
I'd
的，
never heard that
我
before.
从来没有听过这个。
But that his family came from Macedonia.
可是上他的家人是从马其
And
顿，
so they sailed, this little team sailed across to
所以
Macedonia.
这个小船队他们都坐船到马其顿。
By the way, Luke was a Gentile believer,
所以路加是一个外邦的信徒，
and he was a doctor,
也是一个医生。
and Paul kind of needed a doctor.
所以保罗在这个时候真的很需要一个医生跟他一
He
起。
was also a famous historian,
好像路加也是一个历史家，
and he was an author as
也是
well.
很会写书，
So this is a really gifted man.
所以一个也是非常有恩赐的一
So
个
they
人。
get to Macedonia.
他们到了马其顿，
Where's the first place they go?
他们去第一个城市是哪一个城市？在马其顿。
Yes, that's
yes.
it. They went to. I was not going to move on until we got that
我
one.
一直也不会。
This is our goal,
这是我们的目
Philippi.
标，这是腓立比。
So they went to Philippi.
他
You
们到了
guys,
腓立比。
I'm gonna tell you the story a little bit later.
我晚一点会再讲这个故事
But just the basic thing you need to know
基
is
本你了解了。
that they saw some people get saved.
看到人得救，
They started a church.
开拓教会，
They were persecuted,
被逼迫，
and they were asked to leave
后
Philippi.
来被逼要离开。
Now, everybody on the team left Philippi except for Luke.
所以所有的人就离开腓立比，除了路加以外。
Listen, next time you're reading the book of Acts,
下一次你读路加福音，
Try-
路就使徒行传，
try to figure out where Luke is.
试试看每次注意到路加在哪里，
You'll notice it
你们会注意到
because he'll start to write when Luke is not with the team.
路加不在这个团队，
He writes they
他
did
写
they went
他们去
they
哪
went.
里，他
And
们去哪里。
when he joins the team
可是他
again,
加入这个团队
he'll，start writing we
他开始写
went
我
this,
们
and
去
we
哪
went
里，
this.
我们去哪
And
里。
so we know that he didn't go to the next city
所以我们知道他没有再去下一个城市，
because he writes they went
因为他
to.
们开始说
the
他们
next
去哪里了。
But it also could have been a strategy by Paul
可是可能这个也是保罗的策略，
because he failed in Galatia.
因为他在加拉太有失败了，
His original strategy for church planting was not a great strategy.
所以他可能最先的这个策略要开拓教会，不是很好的一个策略，
Because he didn't leave any team members back in the churches to help them grow a little
因为
bit.
他没有留下一个团队，他团队里面的一个队友在那边，他没留下一个帮助他们继续成长。
So starting here in Philippi,
所以我们真的看到他这一次第二次宣教旅程
he's
在腓立比，
leaving a team member back, one or two team members back to help protect the
他
young
就
church.
留一个他的团队里面的一个人，帮助保护这个新的教会。
Okay, so now the team goes to
好
Thessalonica,
所以现在他们其他的人现在都去帖撒罗尼迦，
just a short distance from
短短
Philippi.
的距离，
They spent 2 to 3 weeks there.
花2-3个礼拜在那里了，
They had tremendous fruit.
也结很多果子。
The people just were believing in Jesus.
就是很相信耶稣。
But the synagogue there, they had a synagogue in
可是他们
Thessalonica,
在帖撒罗尼迦有一个犹太人的会堂，
and they got angry with Paul.
他
and
们
the
就
team.
生保罗的气，
So they chased Paul out of Thessalonica.
就是把保罗从帖撒罗尼迦赶出去。
And I don't know who he left in Thessalonica. It could have been Silas, it could have been Timothy.
我们不晓得谁留在帖撒罗尼迦，是提摩太还是希腊。
So whatever was left, Paul and somebody else went to Berea.
后来他们保罗跟不晓得谁跟他一起去，就是去庇利亚，是吗？对
Okay, so that was
对，
that was a short distance away too.
所以这个也是一个短短的距离了。
And the Bereans, the synagogue there was just a really righteous synagogue.
所以这个会堂，犹太人会堂在庇利亚，它反而是一个非常公义的。
Yeah, and it says that they searched the scriptures. They wanted to know what Paul was saying about the Old Testament
他们就
scriptures.
很认真在寻找经节里面到底说有没有符合他们当时的旧约里面的一切的教导。
So people were saved and a church was started there.
所以 人家都得救，后来有一个教会
And
开
I
拓，
don't know how long they stayed there. They stayed there some weeks.
他们在那里留了几个礼拜。
But the synagogue from Thessalonica,
可是帖撒罗尼迦的那个犹太的会堂，
they had chased Paul out of
本
Thessalonica.
来就是把保罗从
And
帖撒
now
罗尼
they
赶出
heard,
去。
now they heard that Paul is in Berea and
现在听到-
impacting the synagogue there.
听到保罗又跑到比利亚，是这样？比利亚，才在那里了。
And so they come and they begin to cause the people to come against Paul.
所以
there
他
in
们
that
就
place.
到了那个城市，使当地的犹太人开始很反对保罗。
Well, Paul had to leave Berea.
保罗又要离开，
He left his team in Berea
他
and
把他的
Thessalonica.
船队就放在那两个城市帖撒罗尼迦跟比利亚。
Luke is not with them anymore.
路加也现在不跟他们在一起，
I'm presuming he's back in
我猜他
Philippi.
在腓立比。
We don't see Luke until the third missionary journey.
现在我们都看不到路加，一直到第3个宣教旅程。
And so now some of the believers from the church, they took Paul out to the ocean and they got on a ship and they sailed all the way down south to Greece, to Athens.
所以现在这个叫比利亚的信徒，他们就把保罗带到海边去，后来坐船一直到希腊，还有雅典，希腊的首都雅
And
典。
then those believers had to go back, so
后来
they
这些信
left
徒
Paul
又把保罗
They left
一个人
Paul
放在那里了，
alone in Athens.
后来
Yes.
在雅典。
So Paul had told his team to meet him in Athens.
所以保罗跟他的团队说：“你们要在雅典跟我会面。
And so now
会
Paul,
见面。
he's just been taken away from these, chased out of these cities.
所以现在保罗是从这3个城市被赶出去了，
And he's by himself.
他一个人，
And he's going into the marketplace
他
sharing the
就是去
gospel.
市场那里分享福音。
Pretty soon he's actually standing in front of all these philosophers
很
sharing the
快
gospel.
就站
to
在
them.
很多的哲学家前面分享福音。
But only a few people got saved.
可是有几个人，雅典就有几个人信耶稣。
And we never hear that there was a church planted there.
我们之后也没有听到雅典真的
So
有教会开始。
I think that Paul maybe was a little bit discouraged.
可能保罗有一点沮丧，
He was supposed to wait in Athens.
他应该在雅典等
But
他的团队，
I think he was tired of waiting in
可能
Athens.
他就不再等，
So he just went a short distance to the west,
又来往西的一个小距离了，
to the city of Corinth.
到格林多。
His team eventually found him there.
他的团队最后就是在那里找到
And
他。
Paul had an amazing ministry in Corinth.
后来保罗在格林多有很棒的一个服侍的
He
时
was
间，
walking in power.
他是走在神的大能，
People were getting saved.
人家得救了，
He ended up spending a year and a half in Corinth.
所以后来这变成花了1年半，在格林多花了1年半的时间，
And actually a powerful church was
一
started
个
in
强
that
壮的
place.
教会就在那里
When
被
he
建
first
立。
got to Corinth, he ran into a couple of people.
所以他先到了格林多，他遇见了几个人了。
He met them for the first
第
time.
一次遇见一对夫妻，
Oh, well, yeah, you gave it away. Yeah. Who was it?
他是遇见什么夫妻？
Yeah, that's
雅居
right.
跟百基拉，
Ananias and Sapphira. So Priscilla and Aquila.
所以百基拉跟雅基拉，
And what did they have in common with Paul?
他跟保罗有什么共通点？是帐篷，对，
That's right. They made tents.
他们就一起。
But Priscilla and Aquila they'd come from Rome, where the Jews had been kicked out of
所以
Rome.
雅基拉跟百基拉他们是从罗马被赶出去，因为当时罗马的基督徒就被
And
赶
so
出
now
去，
they're with Paul
所以现在是
doing this
跟保
ministry.
罗一起在做这个服事了。
At the end of this time, they were getting kicked out of Corinth also.
所以在这个时间的时候，结束的时候，他们也是从格林多被赶出去。
And Paul and his team and Priscilla and Aquila, they sailed off towards
所以
Ephesus.
到最后就是保罗跟他的船队，还有亚基拉、百基拉，就是坐船回去以弗所。
And Paul and Aquila and Priscilla would help to get the church started in Ephesus.
所以变成亚基拉、百基拉，他们会放在那里，他们会开始在以弗所的这个
So
教
Paul
会。
actually went into the synagogue in Ephesus.
所以保罗进去以弗所的那个会堂。
By the way, you know that as a rabbi, he could go into any synagogue.
因为他是拉比，所以他可以去任何的会堂。
And the synagogue would always welcome visiting rabbis to speak.
他们每次都欢迎任何拜访他们的拉比来分享。
So that's why it was so easy for Paul to go to any
所以为什么
synagogue.
保罗非常容易去任何
So
的
he
一个
did
会
that
堂
at？ Ephesus.
他是在以弗所这样做，
And he got an interesting response.
它是一个很有趣的一个反应。
They said, "Tell us more. We want to know more."
请告诉我们更多。
And then Paul responded in an interesting
后来
way.
保罗是一个很特别的反应，
He said, "No,
他说不，
I have to leave now,
我现在要离开，
but I will come back.
可是我会回
I
来，
promise you, I will come back."
我答应我会回来。
So Paul left with his team. They
所以
went
保罗
back.
跟他的船队
They
回
went
去，
back to Jerusalem and then back to Antioch.
回去耶路撒冷，后来回去安提亚。
Okay. How are you doing?
你们还活着吗？
We've done 2 missionary
我们
journeys,
现
so
在已
we're
经
we're
完
very
成
close.
2个宣教旅程，
The 3rd missionary journey was Paul's longest.
所以3个宣教旅程就是保罗的最长的，
It was from 52 to 57
就
AD.
是52到57。
He was 52 years old when he started
他
this.
开始52岁了，
That's kind of old,
就是有点年纪大了
and，he's still going
可
strong.
是他还是很强壮的往前走了。
Now it's not old at all.
Yeah,
It's
it's
not.
not
Sorry,
old.
I'm sorry. It was old for Paul. Okay, it was old for
Paul.
Paul. The purposes of this journey.
他这一次的宣教旅程，
It's just a little bit of a different missionary journey than the first
就
2.
是跟前2个有一点不一样。
Most of the time, he and his team spent strengthening the churches that they've already planted
In the previous 2 journeys，
in the previous 2 journeys. He's now in his 3rd journey,
Yeah,
and the
since-
purpose of the 3rd journey is to strengthen the churches he planted in
所以
the
他
first
现在
2
在
journeys.
3次的宣教旅程，就是要使他已经所建立的教会更强壮。
And you see him do that. You see them do
所以
that.
你就看到他这样做。
He did have a little bit of starting new churches,
在有一点点的开拓新教会
but
了，
I'll talk to you how that happened
可是
in
会
just a
再
second.
等一下跟你们说。
But there was
这个
another purpose that Paul
可
had.
是有另外一个目标，
It maybe was not as important as these first
可
purposes,
能不一定是最重要的。
but Paul wanted to collect a love offering from all of the Gentile churches that he had started.
保罗很想要收一个奉献，从那些外邦人的教会里面收奉献。
And so he wanted to take this offering from the Gentile churches and give to the church in
他
Jerusalem.
想把这些外邦人奉献给耶路撒冷教会。
I think he thought that it would help to maybe bind them together a little bit.
可能他觉得这个会帮助拉近关系，
Especially the church in Jerusalem, the Jewish
Yes,
church in Jerusalem, that they would see the honor that
犹
these
太人的
other...
教会，耶路撒冷犹太人教会可以看到外邦的教会多尊荣他们了。
And I believe that wasn't there a famine going on in
也有
Jerusalem
一
at
个
this
饥
time?
荒在这里了，
And so it was to help the
也是
church
帮助这个
there.
饥荒。
So those are the main purposes of this 3rd missionary
所以这
journey.
是第3次的宣教旅程，
It started very much like the 2nd
就
missionary
是
journey.
跟第2次宣教旅程蛮像的。
Probably Paul and Silas and Timothy,
保罗、希拉、提摩太
they went north again up
又是
into Galatia.
又是往北的方向到加拉太，
They went to all the 4 different churches that
去
they
到
planted
4
there.
间以前开拓的教会了。
But this time, they continued on into Asia, going a little bit further north into the west. They went back to Ephesus.
他们就回去以弗所。
Paul would spend almost 3 amazing years in Ephesus.
后来保罗花了3年在以弗
If
所。
you haven't read about his time in Ephesus in a while, go read that.
如果你最近没有读他在以弗所的这段时间，就鼓励你去读。
It's a lot of fun.
这是很有趣。
And Paul was walking in power in
也是
that time.
保罗在这里大有神的
And
恩膏在他
he
身
was
上。
able to go back to the synagogue.
他回去这个犹太人的会堂，
He spoke for quite a few weeks there.
他在那里讲了好几个礼拜。
And until some of the people started to get angry with
后来有
him.
一些人生他的气，
And so then he stopped going to
后
the
来不再
synagogue
在会堂，
and spent his time running a school. He ran a school every
后来
day.
开一个每天的一个训练学校，
And he was strengthening the church. It was a young church in
就是
Ephesus.
以弗所就是一个刚开拓不久的一个教
Now,
会。
we don't know of Paul starting any churches
我们不晓得保罗
around
在
Ephesus.
以弗所附近开的什么教会，
There were a lot of cities in the area.
在很多别的城市。
But we know that there were a lot of churches started
可是
in the different towns around
我们
Ephesus.
知道，在以弗所附近的这些城市，很多的教会
So
被建立。
we know, Colossae.
格罗西，
Paul never went to
好
Colossae.
像保罗不去格罗西，
But this was started by someone that Paul had sent out from
可
Ephesus.
是是一个人保罗从以弗所才派一个人去那里
So
开拓
there
教会，
really was a lot of starting of churches going on
所
at
以
this time.
还是很多，在这个时候还是很多开拓新
Paul
教
was
会。
sending the believers from Ephesus and his team members out to plant churches in these
所以
other
保罗是才派他的团队的一些人出去开拓
So a
教
lot
会。
of people believe that in Revelation chapter 2 and 3,
所以很多人相信在启示录第2章、第3章
you have the letters to the
有
7
那
churches in
不是有那
Asia.
7间教会吗？
A lot of people believe that those churches were planted by the people that Paul was sending out
就是那
into this
7间教
region.
会好像就是保罗才派出去
So this was
的人开拓这些教会啊。
So this was a really productive time.
所以这个是一个
for
非常
Paul.
有效率
It was a
的一段时
it
间，
was a very restful time for
也是
Paul.
保罗也是一个比较可以安息的一个时间。
This was a time where he was able to write letters encouraging some of the other churches.
也是一段时间才可以写信给一些教会了。
He's famous in Ephesus. He's famous for writing, I think, 4 letters to Corinth, to the believers in Corinth.
他在这个时候大概写了4封信给格林多，
But we only have 2 of
我
them.
们只有剩下两封信，
Okay, so that was a great time.
是这个很好的
But
时间。
eventually they got kicked out of Ephesus.
后来最后就从以弗所被赶出去，
They went back up and went over to Macedonia
后来
again.
又到马其顿，
Somewhere over there they found Luke.
又在那里
I
又
don't know
找
where they
到
found
路加
Luke.，And they spent about a year in Macedonia. These different churches
后
that
来
they
在
planted there.
马其顿花了差不多1年的时间，
Then they went south for about
南的
3
方向。
months into Greece and to Corinth.
3个月是在希腊还有格林多，
They got chased out of there. They went
后来从那里被
all
赶
the
出
way.
去，
They sailed all the way back down.
后
They're
来
going towards
后来
Jerusalem.
要往耶路撒冷的方向，
Of course, this whole time they're collecting the offerings
在
from
这
all
里一
these
直收奉
churches.
献，这些不同教会的奉
He
献。
wants to take them on Passover. He wants to take it to
希
Jerusalem,
望在逾
give
越
it
节
to
里
the
面就
church
可以
there.
带给犹太人的教会。
Sometime on the way back,
他们回去的路上，
it was prophesied that if he continued on to Jerusalem, he would be imprisoned.
有人跟着说，先知性话说，如果你继续往耶路撒冷，你就会被逮捕。
It was not a warning.
不是一个警告，
It was not, don't do it, Paul, don't do it.
不是说保罗你不要做，你
It
不要
was
做。
just a prophetic, if you go, this is what's going to
如果
happen
你
to you.
去，这些事情会发生。
And so Paul continued to go back. He felt God calling him to go
所以
back.
保罗还是觉得要回耶路撒冷。
Paul's 3 missionary journeys.
虽然我们讲完他的3次宣教旅程，
From 57 AD to 62 AD,
所以57到62，
this is when Paul has just returned to
就
Jerusalem.
是 保罗刚回耶路撒冷。
We have a period of time where he is in prison.
我们有一段时间他是在坐牢。
And so that's what 5 years where he's in
5年
prison.
他在坐牢。
Now it starts with the Jerusalem church. I don't know why they did this, but they were trying to help Paul.
我不晓得耶路撒冷的教会为什么这样做，可是他们好像想要世界帮助保罗。
Listen, they knew that the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem hated Paul.
他们知道犹太人非常恨保罗。
I mean, really
真的
hated
很
Paul.
恨保罗。
And so they said, hey, this will help.
如果你这样做，可能会有帮助。
We have 3 young Jews that
我们有
need to take their vows in the temple.
3个年轻的犹太人需要在圣殿里面发誓。
And if you will pay for these young men,
如果你会付他们的费用，
and you take them into
你
the
就带
temple,
领他们进去
then
圣殿。
I think that somehow the Jewish leaders will like you.
犹太人领袖可能会就比较会接纳你。
Okay. So Paul agreed to do
所以
this.
保罗就答应这样做，
And he took these young men into the temple.
带了这3个年轻
Now
男
listen,
生
the
进去圣
Jewish
殿。
leaders knew that Paul was in Jerusalem.
所以犹太的领袖他们已经知道保罗到了耶路撒冷，
They had seen Paul
他们可能
walking
已
around
经看过
Jerusalem.
保罗走来走
They
去。
saw Paul come in with several Gentile believers.
他们看到保罗跟好几个外邦的信徒。
And so now they're inside the temple. Paul is inside the
现
temple.
在保罗他是在圣殿里面，
And the Jewish leaders, they see Paul with 3 young men.
他们看到保罗跟3个年轻人。
And so they thought, Paul brought Gentiles into the
保
temple.
罗把外邦人带进去我们的圣
And
殿，
so they got angry.
所以他们非常的生气。
And they started riling up the mob
后来
inside the
马上
temple.
引起很多的愤怒在里面。
And they threw Paul out of the temple.
保罗从圣殿赶出去，
But now they're pretty much getting ready to kill him.
可是好像要预备杀保罗。
And some Roman soldiers came
罗
along.
马军队的有一些
And
人
they
经过，
saw what was happening
他
to
看
Paul.
到正在发生的，
So they rescued Paul from this
所
mob.
以他救了保罗从这个群众
And
的
Paul was
攻
trying
击。
to explain things to
保
them.
罗试着解释给他
And the
们，
Jewish leaders were trying to accuse Paul of these
那犹
horrible
太的领
crimes.
袖就攻击保罗犯很多的严重的罪。
And now the Roman leader says, well, I need to get Paul away from the
我
crowd.
需要保罗从这个群众
And so
带
he
走。
starts to take Paul up the stairs
所以他开始
somewhere
把
to the
保
barracks.
罗带到另外一个地方。
And Paul says, hey, can I have a few seconds and say something to
保
everybody?
罗就说：“我可以有一点时间对大家说
Now
话吗
he'd spoken Greek, perfect Greek to the Roman soldier.？”
他跟罗马军人说希腊文。
I mean, perfect.
完美的希腊话。
And so the Roman soldier says, wow, how do you know Greek so
哇，
well?
你的希腊文怎么那么好？
So he says, sure, go ahead and say
他
what you
说
want
可以
to.
可以，你可以讲。
So then Paul goes back to Hebrew.
保罗就回去讲希腊
And
文，讲希伯来文，
he shared his testimony of getting
就
saved.
分享他得救的见证。
And then, of course, at the end, that makes all the Jews really
那这个
angry.
是
with Paul.
犹太人更生气。
So the Roman officer says, okay, he called one of his men and says, take him up to the barracks, to this other place.
你把保罗带到另外一个地方。
And Paul goes up there with the
保
soldiers.
罗跟军人都上去那个地方。
And they strap Paul up on some kind of, I don't know, they just
他们
strapped him up.
就把他绑起来
They，were getting ready to beat him.
要鞭打他。
And the one Roman soldier said, we're going to beat you, and then we're going to tell you, and then we're going to ask you questions.
你说我们会鞭打你，后来问问题了。
And Paul said to him,
保罗就对他说
says, listen, is it acceptable for you to beat a Roman citizen without trial?：“
你可以鞭打一个罗马国民，如果先没有经过法院，是可以吗
And the guy was shocked.？”
所以这个人就被吓
And
到
so，he ran out to get his
他上
boss.
去要找他的老板，
And his boss came
他
back
的老板回来，
and he says, "Is it true that you're a Roman
你
citizen?"
真的是罗马国民是吗？
And Paul says, "Yes."
保罗说是的，
And so the soldier says, "So did you buy your Roman
所以
citizenship?"
这个军人他就说你是用买的是吗？
I bought my Roman
我的
citizenship.
国民我是用买的，
Did you buy yours?
你是买你的吗？
And Paul says, "No.
保罗说没有
I
了，
was born a Roman
我是
citizen."
一出生我就是，
So they
我就是罗马，
quickly untied
所以
him.
很快就把他解
And
开。
they were a little bit afraid of Paul
有点
now
真的很怕保罗，
because they were not allowed to do what they
你们
did to a Roman
不能
citizen.
这样对待一个罗马国民。
So now this Roman soldier has a responsibility towards
所
Paul.
以现在这个罗马军人他也对保罗有责
He's
任。
not just dealing with a Jew,
我们不是他现在面对的不是一个
he's
一般的
dealing with a
犹太
Roman
人，
citizen.
他现在面对一个罗马国
So
民，
he's responsible to protect Paul,
所以现在他的责任要
to
保
keep
护，
him safe from the
要
Jews.
确定他是从犹太人就是很安全，
So he takes him away to a place to protect him.
所以就得把他带到另外一个地方去，要保护他。
Later on, maybe the next day or so, they learned about a plot that the Jews were going to kill Paul.
后来他们都发现有一个计谋，犹太人想要杀保罗，
So the Roman soldiers took Paul secretly away from Jerusalem out to the city of Caesarea.
所以他们就秘密的把保罗带到另外一个城市，叫做凯撒利亚，是不是？凯撒利亚，凯撒利亚。
And so, of course, the Jewish leaders were angry.
那犹太人就非常的生气
And，they followed Paul to
他
Caesarea.
们就凯撒利一直跟随保罗到凯撒
And
利
they
亚。
were appealing to the governor there
后来
to,
在那边一直
he's deserving of death.
这个人要死了，应该
Just
被判死刑。
Give him to us and we'll try him
你
according to our.
们就把他
to our
交在我们的
standards.
手里，我们会自己做审判。
But they knew that this was a Roman citizen.
可
Paul
是他
was a
们知
Roman
道保
citizen.
罗他是一个罗马的国民，
So they kept him in it's like the governor's palace in Caesarea for 2 years.
所以他们在盖萨利亚里面，他们就把保罗继续关在一个地方。
Now it was imprisonment, but it was a very easy
是
imprisonment.
被关，可是也不是太辛苦的
He
一
was
种。
allowed to have people visit
有
him.
人可以来拜访他，
And in fact, he talked to the governors sometimes.
他有时候也是跟这些官里面可以说话了。
And the whole time, the Jews are wanting him to be freed.
犹太人就一直希望
Now, the Roman governor
给把保罗交在他们的手中。
the Roman governor couldn't find that Paul had done anything
那
wrong.
这个罗马的官，他们找不出来到底保罗做
But
错什么事情，
he kept him in prison.
可是他还是继续把他
And this is
放在继续保留在该撒利亚的监狱里面。
this is what it says in the book of Acts.
这在使徒行传这
It
样
says
说，
because Paul would not give him a bribe, would not give
因为
him
他
money.
不可以巴结他了，
Right? So the governor was waiting for some money
他
to
不会
come.
用钱来贿赂他了，所以这些罗马官等着这些钱了。
So after a couple of years,
可是几年后，
a new governor came
有一
in.
个新的官
And the governor asked what Paul was there
说
for.
保罗为什么在那里了？
And he heard the Jews, what the
后来
Jews
听
had
犹
to
太
say.
人说什么，
And he heard what Paul had to
后来也
say.
听到保罗说
And
什
he
么，
says, Paul's done nothing wrong.
说保罗没有做错什么，
I can release you right
我
now.
觉得我现在可以释放他。
Paul did not want to go.
可是保罗
He did not want to leave the
他
prison
不想要离开监狱，
because he knew if he left the prison, the Jews were waiting to kill
因
him.
为他觉得如果再离开监狱，
So
犹太人就会马上杀他。
what Paul said was, I
保罗说，
appeal to Caesar.
对，我向该撒上告。
So as a Roman citizen, any Roman citizen was able to appeal, if they felt they were wrongly accused, they could appeal to the emperor.
如果任何罗马帝国的他觉得他被诬告，他就可以 上诉，向罗马的最大的法院可以上诉。
And a Roman citizen was protected.
后来一个罗马帝国就被保护。
They would be taken to Rome,
他们会被带到罗马去。
and their case would be heard by the emperor.
后来皇帝就会在那里听到他们。
And so that's what happened.
所以就是这样发生。
By the way, Paul maybe also thought this was a great way to get to Rome.
保罗说不定也觉得，这样子去罗马很方便。
He'd already written the Roman Christians
他
a
已经
letter.
有写信给罗马，
He says,
写罗马书。
I long to get, I'm
我
going to
期
come
待
to
去
you
看你
someday.
们了。
And now Paul is sitting there going, thinking,
保罗说，
if I appeal to Caesar, I get a free trip to Rome.
如果我向改撒，就是上诉，我就可以免费去罗马。
Right? So they put him on a ship.
咱们把他坐船。
He had a Roman soldier
他有
with him.
罗马就是军队。
And they sailed to
他们
Rome.
就坐船到罗马。
They had a little
当然
shipwreck
有一
along the
些
way.
小船难在
Right?
当
So
中
it took a little while to get to
所以
Rome.
花一点时间。
But they finally arrived in Rome in
最后
60 AD.
在大概西元后60年到了罗马。
So Paul would have been about 60 years old
所以罗
then.
马保罗那时候差不多60
Now,
岁。
when Paul arrived in Rome, there was such a reception for him.
所以保罗到了罗马，很多人欢迎他。
So many of the believers,
很多的信徒。
and even the Jewish synagogues sent people to find out who this Paul was.
连罗马犹太人的会堂里面的，他们也派人去想更了解保罗。
They'd never heard anything bad about Paul.
他们在罗马还没有听到
So they were
保罗的坏话。
the Jews.
犹太人还没有听到。
And so all these people were visiting Paul when he first got there.
所以他到了那里，很多人拜访他。
And the Roman soldier was allowing this.
还有罗马的军队都允许这种事情。
Because he knew that Paul had not done anything wrong.
他们也知道是保罗没做错
And
什么事情。
Paul had saved them all in the shipwreck.
因为还有保罗在船难里面都救了他
And
们。
so this Roman soldier was pretty happy with
可
Paul.
能这些罗马的军队就是蛮喜欢保
So
罗。
then Paul was put in prison.
所以现在他是在坐牢，
But it wasn't a real prison.
不是一个真实的牢
He was
监狱了。
allowed to rent a house.
他可以租一个房子，
And he would stay in that house chained to a member of the Praetorian Guard.
他在那个就是一个房子，后来他是在这个房子里面就被绑在一个里面的皇。It doesn't have that word in Chinese.
Okay, this was a guard.
像那个守卫，
This was a special soldier of the emperor.
就是皇帝特别的军队里面的一个
Rome was
军人。
not allowed to have common soldiers in it.
所以罗马不能有一般的那些军人，
They were only allowed to have this special
就是特别的
elite
高级的
kind of
高
soldier.
级的这种军人在
And
罗
so
马，
those were the only soldiers there.
所以就是在罗马只有那种
And
高
so
级
the house
等的。
that Paul rented probably was very close to where these soldiers
所以
lived.
保罗就是租的这个房子，可能也是靠近那些军人。
And
Gregg.
Paul lived in this house under arrest. He was in
他是这样
prison.
子活在他自己租的
He's
房子。
waiting for the emperor to say that he will hear his
当
case.
皇帝来听到他的事，
And when he is in this house arrest, that's when he writes several letters.
所以他在罗马坐牢的，就是他写了几封信。
Right? Can you tell me what letters?
可以告诉我他写了什么信？在罗马，
Okay, Philippians.
腓立比、
Yeah, Colossians. That's
yeah.
right. Yeah,
Philemon, yeah.
that's right. Got one more?
还有一封《Thessalonians》
No.
没有，
No, that was written in Corinth, I think.
好像哥林多写的，
It was a very similar book to Colossians.
跟
Very similar letter.
哥罗西很类似的。以弗所，
Ephesians. That's right. Ephesians. So we know that he wrote those 4 letters.
我们知道在罗马他写的这4封信
I，kind of think he wrote more than that.
我相信他写的更多。
But we just don't have them.
可是他们就没有被加在圣
I
经里
mean,
面。
what else was Paul doing?
因为保罗还做什么东
He had all
西？
kinds of time.
他太多时间了。
And can you imagine being the Roman soldier that's chained to him all
你想
day?
保罗的军人那个跟他一起绑起来的，
Because when Paul wrote letters, he didn't write them. He spoke them to somebody, and that person wrote
因
the
为保
letters.
罗他写书信的时候，不是他自己手写的，是他
And
另外一个人写。
These soldiers
可是
are
保罗
hearing the
念。
gospel over and
所以那些
over
军
and
人
over and over again.
军官一直都听到福音。
In 62 AD,
62年了，
Paul was released from
保
prison.
罗就释放了，被释放。
The emperor Nero, he didn't even hear the case
尼禄
probably.
好像可能也没有听到他的事情，可是就
Okay.
释放他。
All right, so for the next 4 years of ministry,
又过了4年的服侍的时间，
well, no, let me say this. The next 4 years,
未来的4年，
we presume Paul was doing ministry,
我们猜保罗是做一些服侍，
but we don't know where he went.
可是我们不是圣经没有写很清楚他
We
去哪
can,
里。
some people guess because of what he said about where he wanted to go
有
someday.
人是用猜测的，因为他之前说他想要去哪
But
里，
we don't know what he was
可是我们
doing.
真的不晓得他有去哪。
But I'm really sure he's out encouraging the churches
可
that
是我
he
想他可
started.
能就是到处去鼓励他所开拓的教
But
会。
after those 4 years,
可是这4年之后，
he was arrested and sent to Rome.
又被逮捕，又被送到到罗马，
So that was about 66
差不多
AD.
西元后66年了。
And this was a time of persecution of Christians.
这个是一个逼迫基督徒的一个时间，整个罗马帝国的
And
逼
so
迫基督徒。
the leaders of the Christians were Peter and Paul.
所以基督徒的领导就是彼得跟保罗
And，so they were put in prison in Rome.
所以他们2个都是在罗马的
But
监
it
狱，
was not a nice little
可
prison.
是不是一个很舒服的一
This
个
is
监
a
狱，
prison for people that were waiting to be
就
executed.
是要等待快要被处死的
In
那
about
种
in
军队。
67 AD,
所以大概67年，
I think Peter and Paul, I think they were executed about the same
我
time.
觉得彼得跟保罗差不多同时被处死。
Peter was executed on a cross.
彼得他是被钉在十字架，
Paul was beheaded.
保罗砍头。
Why was Paul beheaded?
为什么保罗被砍头
Why
呢？
didn't they hang him on a
为
cross?
什么没有把他钉在十字架上呢？
That's right. He was a
因
Roman
为他是罗
citizen.
马帝国的。
You keep hearing that when I'm talking about Paul. He
一
was
直
a
听到
Roman
保罗，这个
citizen.
他是罗马
He
帝
was a
国的
Roman
罗马
citizen.
帝国了，
He knew his rights as a
他
Roman
知道他的
citizen.
权利。
All right. So that's kind of what we know about Paul.
所以这个是我们了解的有
And
关
of
保
course,
罗。
there's a lot that I didn't talk
当
about.
然，很多的细节我们要
I'll
说，
leave you to study that on your
我鼓励
own.
你们自己去挖出来。
Before we go on, though, I want to make sure that you understand who Paul's enemies were.
我要你们很清楚了解保罗的敌人是谁，
Because in Philippians, Paul talks about his enemies really freely.
因为在腓立比书，保罗也谈到他的敌人。
So there are 4 basic enemies that
保
Paul
罗有
had.
4种敌人，
The first one was the Jews.
第一个是犹太人，
You could see this every time Paul went into a synagogue.
看每次保罗去犹太人的会堂，
You could see it when Paul went into the temple in Jerusalem.
看当保罗他去耶路撒冷的圣殿，
The Jews hated Paul,
犹太人真的很恨保罗，
and they hated what he was doing to Judaism.
也恨他怎么样破坏犹太教。
The second enemy of Paul.
第2个敌人，
What's the English word I wanted you to
我要你
remember?
们记得英文的字，
Judaizers.
朱利亚就是那个
These are the Jewish
犹太
Christians
基督徒，
that they were trying to force
强
the
迫
Gentile
外邦
Christians
人
to
的
become
基督徒
Jewish.
要成为犹太人。
All right? And listen, Paul hated the
保罗
Judaizers.
真的很讨厌
I
这些
mean, well, I'll just say he was
犹太基督徒。
angry. He was so angry with what they were
他
doing.
很生他们的气，他们这样子做，
And they were a constant thorn in Paul's side
常常
throughout
都是
his whole ministry.
保罗在他的一切的服侍，他们是一种刺在他的身上的。
All right? And then the third enemy of
第
Paul,
3个保罗的
this
敌
was
人，
the pagan people in the community where Paul was trying
就
to
是社
reach.
区的一般的外邦人。
We see several times where they attacked
我
Paul,
们看了好几次，他们也是
and
攻击保
they
罗，
had Paul thrown in prison.
他们也是把保罗关在监狱。
So these were the people Paul was trying to reach with
所
the
以这个
gospel.
也是实在保罗想要他们得救的一群人。
And then the fourth enemy of Paul,
四个保罗的敌
and that's
人
the，Roman government.
就是罗马的政府。
Now listen, I mean, you don't see them being an enemy of Paul until the very end of
也
Paul's
只是
life.
在保罗的生平最后才变成他的敌人。
But then, of course, they're the ones that killed
可
Paul.
是到最后就是他们杀死保罗。
All right. Now let's go on to, we've just talked about the author
我
of
们
the
刚刚有
book.
谈到
I told you that's a
我们
long
的
thing.
作者，我刚刚说这个是会讲很久很久了。
And I hope we can finish
我
today.
觉得这个今天晚上一定会讲完了，我们试试看。
I want us to look at the recipients,
现在
the
我们要
people
谈到
who
收信
received,
者，
the people who received Paul's letter,
就是收到这封信，
the church members at
这
Philippi.
是腓立比书的腓立比
You
人，
need to understand the city of
好
Philippi.
像需要了解腓立比
You
的
need to,
城
this
市
will，help you to understand the people of Philippi.
会帮助你了解。如果你了解这个城市，你也了解这些人，
And that will help you to understand the believers in
也
Philippi.
也帮助你了解腓立比人。
See, Philippi was a Roman colony.
所以腓立比它是一个罗马帝国管的一个城市，
Okay, so what this was, Philippi was like little Rome.
好像腓立比就是像小罗马。
If you walked into Philippi, you would think that you were in Rome.
如果你走进去腓立比，你就觉得你好像走到罗
This
马
was。located in northern Macedonia.
是在马其顿的北部，
It was a long way away from Rome,
是在离罗马蛮远的。
but the government in Philippi
可是
was
腓立比
Roman.
帝国腓立比的政府是罗马人，
They ran their government just like
So 他们
the
经-
government was run in Rome.
经营他们整个政府、整个管理的，就是用罗马的方
And
式。
the citizens of Philippi, they were given all the rights and the privileges of Roman citizens.
所以腓立比人他们有的像罗马人一样这个权柄，
Just like if they lived in Rome.
就是像他们活在罗马一样。
Okay, so here you have this little city,
所以你有这个小城市，
and it was like a little Rome.
像一个小罗马。
Now, Rome made these special colonies around the land that they conquered.
所以罗马它有像那些小殖民地，在他们管制的一些地方，他们特别有一些城市。
And there's several reasons why they did this.
所以为什么他们有这些特别的城
The
市，
first,
像一个小罗
the
马？
first one was when they went in and conquered a people.
第一，他们进去后来战胜一个民族。
Well, first of all, they wanted a place where the soldiers could be, the Roman soldiers could be, and kind of help control the surrounding area.
他们希望有一个地方，他们的军队可以住在那里，可以控制这个地区。
But they wanted to establish the culture of Rome in that pagan
可
land.
是他们很想要把罗马的文化也建立在这个外邦的地区，
So they made a little Rome.
所以他们做了一个小罗马。
They were very proud of Rome.
他们非常以罗马为
They
荣，
were very proud of the Roman
他
culture.
们以罗马的文化的非常的为荣
And。they thought if just the surrounding, the conquered communities could just see us and copy us, it would help
如
them
果我们现
too.
在战胜的这些不同的文化，如果他们就可以看到我们的文化，后来他们就会被我们改化。
But there's another reason
可是有另外一个原因，
why Rome established these Roman
罗马也
colonies.
是建立这些特别殖民地的那些小城市。
The soldiers of Rome were they were heroes.
罗马帝国的军人，他们是英雄，
And the Roman government knew if we need to take care of our soldiers.
所以我们需要好好的照顾我们
The
的军
people
人。
love the soldiers.
所以人家当时喜欢这些
But
罗
we
马帝
need
国
to，treat our soldiers
我们
well.
要对待我们的军人，要
So
对待他们很好。
when their soldiers had been out fighting
所以他们出去打仗，
and they had spent enough years being a
他
soldier,
们花了很多
Roman
年
soldier,
当军人，
and it was time for them to retire.
还他们回来的时候，
The Roman government promised that they could come back to Rome and they would give them land.
所以他们就 承诺这些军人说，你以后打完仗，你
Or
就
they
可以回来罗马，我们可以给你们，我们会帮你们预备地，
Or they would give them a housing.
还是我们会给你们房子住。
They promised to take special care of these
他们就
Roman
答应
soldiers.
要好好的照顾这些士兵。
Well, can you imagine the problem?
你可以想象这个问题了。
Rome is they're conquering all these
罗马
places.
真的在战胜很大的一个地方，
Takes a lot of soldiers.
需要很多的军人。
And now the soldiers are beginning to retire.
现在军人慢慢就开始退休，
They don't have enough room
可是
in
他们罗
Rome.
马没有不够大地方可以给这些士兵、这些
They
军人，
started putting Rome over here
所以
and
开
over
始这里有一
here
个小
and
罗
over
马，这里
here.
有一个小罗马。
And that's what Philippi
后
was.
来腓立比就是这种地
It
方
was a
啊，
place where a lot of Roman soldiers would
就
retire.
是退休的罗马军人他们会
And
住
where
的地方，
the people of the city would honor them and
而这些
respect
城
them.
市的人会尊敬、尊荣他
That's
们。
where they could get their promise of all of these that Rome had made to
他
them.
们就可以在那里得到罗马给他们这个承诺。
Now, that's what Philippi
所以
was.
腓立比就是这种
It
城
was
市，
a little Rome.
是一个小罗马。
Now, they had a real diverse makeup of citizens.
所以腓立比有一个民族实在蛮复杂的。
Now, of course, you have Romans,
你先有罗马人，
but there are also Greeks and
可是也有
other
希腊人。
different people from the area.
也有别人在这个地区。
But many of the people in Philippi would have been ex-military men and their families,
可是很多真的都是以前军人，还有他们的家人，
because that's where they were going after they
因
retired.
为这是他们退休去的地方了。
Think of the jail keeper who kept Paul and Silas in jail.
你想管这个监狱的，在保罗跟希腊的这个监狱，
He was an
狱主
ex-soldier.
狱主他也大概是一个以前的军人。
And these military men
So
in
这些军人
Philippi, they were all, in fact, all of the citizens of Philippi, they were proud of their Roman
他们都
citizenship.
是以他们的国民为荣，就是以他们的罗马，
They saw, wow, Rome is the best.
罗马是最棒的，
They know how to serve us.
罗马知道怎么管我们了。
Their culture is amazing.
罗马文化罗马文化最高级。
So think about what the people were like in Philippi.
所以你想起腓立比的人是怎么样？
That's what the church was like.
教会就是这样。
Same kind of people in the church that were in.
所以因为教会的就是这些人是在后来信耶稣了。
Now we know that there were not when Paul and Silas first went to Philippi.
保罗跟希腊最先到腓立比，
We know that there were not too many Jews
我们
in
知道
Philippi.
犹太人非常少，
And we know
那个
that
地区的，
we know that because there was no synagogue.
因为
in
没有会堂，
Philippi.
没有犹太人的会堂。
There was kind of a rule that the Jews had
犹太人有一个规定，
that you have to have at least 10 male Jews in order to start a synagogue.
要有10个男的犹太人才可以开一个会堂。
So they didn't have many Jews in
他们
Philippi.
犹太人非常少，
And so when Paul and Silas came into Philippi,
So
they couldn't use their normal way of
所
starting
以
a
保
church.
罗跟希腊去了腓立比，他们不能用他们平常用的方
They
式，
couldn't go to the synagogue first and preach.
没有会堂可以去
But what
传扬。
they did is on the Sabbath, they went down to the river.
可是他们安息日，他们就去河边。
And I think it was kind of traditional that any Jews that had become Jews,
因为犹太人还是外邦人变成犹太人，
they would meet at the river.
他们会在河
They
边，
didn't have a synagogue; they would meet
他
at
们
the
没有
river.
会堂，可是他
So
们会在河边。
Paul and Silas, Timothy, maybe
保
Luke, they all
罗、
went
希腊
down there.、
路加、
They
提摩太可能
found several women
找
down
几个
there,
姐妹在那里，
Jewish converts,
就是可能是有的也是外邦人信犹
and
太
they
教
were，gathered at the river for prayer.
他们就在那里是聚集在一起祷告。
What was the name of one of these
当
women?
中一个女孩子叫什么名字？
That's right, Lydia.
对，
She was an influential businesswoman.
她是一个企业家。
She and her family listened to Paul and his team, and they got saved.
跟着家人，他们听保罗的教导， 后来他们全家得救。
So the whole team went to stay in Lydia's house.
所以整个团队就去 Lydia 的家，也住在那里。
You guys know the rest of the story pretty well.
我想剩下的故事你们也了解了。
Paul cast the demon out of the slave girl.
保罗把那个婢女叫什么？那个仆人把鬼赶出去了。
The owners of this girl were furious.
还有那个拥有这个婢女的，他们就很生气。
So they dragged Paul and Silas before the judgment seat.
保罗跟希拉都被拉到法院。
Now listen, it didn't help Paul and Silas that they were Jewish. That did not help them at all.
不是，他们是犹太人，没有帮助保罗跟希拉。
Because about 49 AD,
因为西元后49年
that was just right before Paul's arrival in
就
Philippi.
是在保罗第一次到了腓立比第一次，
The Jews were kicked out of Rome
犹太人从罗马被赶出去，
because they were apparently starting some riots.
因为好像他们在罗马造成麻
So
烦，
here is big Rome,
所以现在大罗马在
and
这里
they kick all the Jews out
把
of
犹太
Rome.
人赶出去了。
And now you're in little Rome in
现在你是
Philippi,
小罗马腓立比，
and here comes some Jews.
后来来了一些犹太人了，
And that's why it may have been difficult for the Jews that were in Philippi
可
at
能
that
也是
time.
已经在腓立比的这些犹太人可能不多，可是也是有困难。
And so when these men found out that Paul and Silas were Jews,
所以这些腓立比人发现他们保罗跟希拉他们是犹太人，
they take them to the judges
他们就要把它放在法官前面。
and say, look, we have some Jews,
看这里，我们有犹太
and
人，
they're trying to ruin our
他
culture,
们在要破坏我们的
our
文化，
beloved Roman
我们宝
culture.
贵的罗马
They're
文化，
trying to change our
他们
ways.
要改变我们的做法。
I mean, little Rome
小罗马
was not happy with
不
this.
高兴这个，
So that helps explain why all of this happened really fast.
这是有一点了解为什么这么快就发生这
Where
么多
they
事情。
beat
马上
Paul
就
and
鞭
Silas.
打他们
They
了，
jailed them.
后来把他们放在监狱里
God
面。
did a miracle.
神做了一个神
The
迹，
earthquake set them free.
地震释放了他
And
们。
then the jailer and his family got
后来
saved.
狱主跟他的家人都信耶稣了。
Okay, so the jailer, the ex-soldier,
狱主就大概是以前也是一个
he and
军
his
人，
family got saved.
他跟他家人
So
得
now
救，
they become part of the new church
所以
in
现在他们
Philippi.
就成为新教会的一份子。
Now the next day,
第二天，
the judges that had found Paul and Silas guilty,
就是
basically.
这些法官发现，就是审判保罗跟希拉，
They sent a message to the jailer.
他们就传话给这个狱主，
And the message says, okay, you can go ahead and release these two men.
现在可以释放这两个男生。
And Paul responded really harshly.
所以保罗就很严厉的反应。
It just didn't seem like, why would Paul be so
为
harsh
什么
on
保
this
罗
kind
在
of
这里那么
thing?
凶
And？here's how he responded.
他怎么说？
And he says, you take this message back to them.
你把这个话传
He
给
says,
他们，
these judges,
这些法官，
they beat us in public without trial.
我们没有经过法院就先鞭打我们，
Excuse me, we're Roman
我们
citizens.
是罗马国民，
And they beat us in public without
可是他
trial.
们在公开的地方先鞭打我
And
们，
now they want us to leave quiet. They threw us in jail.
后来把我们关在监狱里面。
And now they want us to leave town
现在我
quietly.
们要我们很安静，就离开这个城市。
Paul says, no,
不，
we're not going.
我们不会那么
You
平安的
you
走。
tell those guys that they can come and tell us themselves.
你跟这些法官跟他们说，他们可以自己来跟我们讲话。
Listen, when the judges found out that Paul and Silas were Roman
所以
citizens,
当这些法官发现，哇，保罗跟希拉是罗马国民，
they got scared.
他们就很害怕。
It says they came and they begged Paul
他
and
们
Silas
说：“
to
拜
leave
托拜托，保罗
Philippi.
跟希拉要离开。
Listen, as Roman citizens,
做罗马帝国的人，
Paul and Silas were both Roman
他们都
citizens,
是罗马帝国的，
and they were in a Roman colony.
也是在一个罗马殖民地，
Paul and Silas should have been protected by Roman law.
所以保罗跟希拉应该是罗马法律应该是保护他们。
And the leaders, the judges who abused Paul and Silas, they could have been in huge trouble.
所以这些法官也是可以遇见大问题了。
So if big Rome, the
所以
Roman
如果
government,
大罗马
they found out, hey, two Roman citizens were
发现
beat and jailed
两
without a
个国民
trial.
没有经过法院，他们就会被鞭打。
Big Rome would have probably sent and killed those
大罗
leaders.
马说不定会杀那些
That's why they were so
法
scared.
官，所以
That's
他
why
们
they
很
were
害
so
怕。
scared. I think,
我觉得
I mean, I could be wrong on this,
有可能
but
我
I
错了。
think that Paul was so severe in his response
我觉得保罗的反应这么凶，
because he wanted the leaders who had done this to keep fear,
是希望他们有
to
一点惧
remember
怕。
the fear.
他们这些做了这些事情的领导的是希望他们会有怕，
I think he wanted them to remember Paul and Silas and what they'd
他
done.
要记得他们怎么样对待
And,
保罗
and to
跟
remember that at any
跟希腊。
and to remember that at any moment Paul and Silas could go to Rome and appeal to
做
the
任何
emperor.
时刻，保罗跟希腊可以去大罗马来上诉。
Why would he want them to be afraid of that?
为什么他要他们怕这个？
Because I think he wanted to protect the young believers in
我
the
相信
church
他
in
想要
Philippi.
保护这些刚开始信耶稣的这些信徒。
So that before the leaders of the city would persecute them, they would remember, oh, these guys were friends of
所
Paul.
以他们不会随便开始攻击这个刚开拓的一个教会。
And so, we need to be careful because Paul and Silas could cause our
我们
deaths
要很
here.
小心，因为保罗跟希腊，他们会攻击我们。如果我们攻击那个刚开的教会了，
All right.
好，
Now, when you read Philippians,
当你读腓立比书，
keep in mind the ex-soldiers that were in the church.
试试看思考这些以前老罗马士兵，
Because Paul uses several military expressions in his letter that would have meant a lot to these ex-soldiers.
因为保罗在腓立比书里面用好几个是军人等的一些说法。
Now, it's not always easy to recognize these phrases,
有
these
时候我们不
expressions.
一定完全很容易认出来这些话，
You'll have to do a little bit of study with
可
the
能
Greek.
要研究一下希腊文
But
了。
I'll give you a hint. Most of these expressions are found in chapter 1 and chapter 3.
大部分都是在第1章跟第3章。
For example,
譬如说，
in Philippians 1:12,
1章第12节，
Paul said that what happened to him had served to advance the gospel or to cause progress for the gospel.
所以他说他所遭遇的事，便是叫福音兴旺。
Okay, and the word there for advance,
在这里，兴旺这个字，
that's a special military term.
这是一个特别军人用的一个
And
字。
it's when a huge army was marching through a land,
当一个大的军队走在一个新的国家，
they would take certain special soldiers and they'd put them in front
他们会把好的军人放在前面，
and they would cut down all the trees.
后来先把所有的树砍下去。
And that was called the advance.
这个就是叫做兴旺，就是那些走在
They,
前
they
面的。
were helping they were making it really easy, preparing an easy way for the rest of the soldiers to come
好
behind
像他
them.
们是预备，所以后面的军人很容易走，因为树已经被砍下去，
So there would not be any more hindrance for this huge army
不会
coming
有
through.
拦阻。当大军队来的时候，走在那个前锋的，他们已经解决这些问题了。
So when Paul is saying, I went through these things so that I could be all these things, these bad things that happened to me, I was being an advance for you.
所以好像保罗就是说，这些不好的事情发生，可是那个反而就是好像我为你们铺路，我福音被兴旺
I'm going first.
我会先去做砍
And
树，
it will make it easier for you guys
所以
to share
这
the
些事
gospel.
情你
in
们就
here.
更容易分
So,
享福
so
音。
I don't know if you can use any of this stuff in your sermons, but it's interesting to know this.
可是这是了解这个是很有
Paul
趣
is。speaking to soldiers, ex-soldiers
保罗也
here.
是跟
At
很
least
多
some of
人
them.
也好几个是一定是以前是当军人。
Now, there are some other important things you need to know about this church in
很重要，你
Philippi.
也是要了解有关这个教会。
First of all, they were persecuted
他们是被逼迫的，
and they were suffering.
他们也是受逼迫的。
I think much the same way that Paul had suffered in
我
Philippi.
想也是在 保罗在腓立比所
I
经历
mean,
的，
we don't know exactly what was happening to them.
我们不是完全了解他们所经历的。
But we know that their enemies here were not the Jews.
我觉得他们敌人不是犹太人，
We know that their enemies were not the Judaizers.
他们的敌人也不是那些犹太的基督徒，使他们要变成犹太人。
Right? It probably means that it was the local community that was
可能是社区的，还是
persecuting them.
还是有开始逼迫他们。
Okay? So, but you just need to know that they were
就
persecuted.
是要
They
了解
were
他们
going
也是
through
在
persecution.
经历逼迫。
Something else you need to know about
另外
this
你要
church
了解了，
is that the Philippian church they were very generous.
他们是非常慷慨的一个教会。
They latched on to Paul and they supported Paul through all of his years of ministry.
他在保罗的一切的服侍，他们都在金钱上支持保
You
罗。
know, Paul had just gotten kicked out of Philippi.
保罗刚从罗马帝国，从腓立比被赶出去，
The next place he went was
他们
Thessalonica.
去下一个地方就是铁
He
撒
was
罗尼迦
only。there 2 or 3
他
weeks.
在铁撒罗尼迦才2-3个礼
And
拜。
during that time, the church at Philippi, this little baby church at Philippi, they raised money and they sent it to
但是
Paul
在
in
这个短短
Thessalonica.
的三个礼拜，这个刚开拓的腓立比教会，他们已经收奉献寄给保罗。
And later, when in the same missionary journey, when Paul was in Corinth,
当保罗在格林多，
they sent another offering to
哇，腓
Paul.
立比教会又收奉献寄给保罗。
And now they had just sent another offering to Paul that was sent to him in Rome while
所
he
以
was in
现在他
Rome.
在写这个腓立比书的这封信，他刚收到，又收
So
到他们的奉献。
Philippi was an extremely generous supporting
所以
church,
腓立比
especially of
书
Paul.
是非常慷慨的教会，特别针对保罗，一直奉献给他了。
If you write this down, write the scripture, 2
Okay.
Corinthians 8:1-4.
就是格林多后书第8章第1到第4节，
That's a good picture of the generosity of the Philippian
这个
church.
是形容腓立比教会的慷慨。
This is describing when the Philippian church, the Macedonian church, was giving to the church in Jerusalem.
就是形容腓立比，就是马其顿的教会里怎么样奉献给耶路撒冷的
It
教会，
just describes this
Just-
generous
形容这个非常
people.
慷慨的一群
Okay,
人。
so you need to know that about this church.
所以是需要了解这个有关这个
Okay,
教会。
so that's the audience
好，这
basically.
个是收信者，
All right, now one last little
最后一个。
thing. We're going to finish early.
我们会提早结
I'm
束
so
了，
happy.
非常棒。
We want to talk about the purposes of the letter.
我们要谈到写这封信的目标、目的。
Listen, there are several different reasons why Paul wrote this letter to the
好
Philippians.
像有好几个原因，为什么保罗写这封信给腓立比人？
There are a couple of reasons that are pretty simple. They're pretty obvious.
蛮明显的，有几个蛮明显的原因。
But there's also a few reasons that are a little deeper.
可是也有一些比较深奥的理由，
Things
为什
that
么
you
他
have
写
to you have to look a little bit harder for, but they're
你可能
there. They're very easy
也
to
需要
see.
挖得更深才看到了。
Okay, so let's look at a couple of the obvious
我
reasons.
想我们看明显的理由。
I told you Paul had just received this offering from the church in Philippi.
我跟你们说，保罗刚收到奉献，收到腓立比书
The-
腓立比的教会的奉献，
The church sent a young man from their church named Epaphroditus.
所以教会他们差派一个年轻人
And
叫做以巴弗提。
they sent that offering through that young man brought that to
所以
Paul.
这个年轻信徒他就把这个奉献
And like I
给
said,
保
the
罗。
Philippian church had supported Paul throughout his ministry.
所以说腓立比教会一直有支持保罗。
So why did Paul write this letter now
所
to
以
the
为什么现
Philippian
在
church?
他写这封信给他们了？
It was a simple thank you letter.
这是一个感谢卡
You can see that especially in chapter 4.
所以第4章可以看到，
This is like a big thank you note.
就是真的是一个大的一个感谢卡。
There's another reason
有另外一个原因，
that Paul wrote this letter.
保罗写这封信，
Is this young man Epaphroditus?
就是以巴弗提这个年轻
Yeah,
弟兄，
he was expected to take the offering to Paul,
他是要把这个奉献给保罗，
but he was also sent to Rome to serve Paul.
可是他也被教会也差派他去去罗马要服侍保罗。
The Philippian church, they knew that Paul was maybe not in such great health.
我觉得可能保罗的身体不是这么的
And then
健
he'd
康，
been in prison for 5 years.
他已经在那里关，
You know,
已经5年在关，
and he'd gone through shipwrecks.
还有经过船
And
难，
so they sent this young man to see if he could serve
所以
Paul.
就差派这个
And
年轻人，希望他可以服侍保
But
罗。
Epaphroditus,
可是以巴弗提
he got very sick.
他就突然生病了，
And he almost died.
差一点死了，
And so I'm guessing that he didn't help Paul a lot.
所以可能没有办法帮助保罗。
In fact, I'm guessing that Paul maybe served him more
可能
than
就
he
变成
served Paul.
保罗要服侍这个以巴
And
以巴
now
弗提
this young man was returning to
所
Philippi.
以现在他这个年轻人要回
He was
腓立
taking
比，
Paul's letter
把保罗
with
的
him.
信要带回去腓立比。
And Paul did not want the church to think badly about this young man.
他们不希望他们是以错误的眼光看这个年轻
And
人。
you'll see that when you read
我想你
about
读
him.
的，你可能可以看到，
He's always trying to make Epaphroditus look really good.
好像一直要让人家看以巴弗提都是好像很棒的一
You
个
know,
弟兄。
welcome him when he comes
欢迎
home.
他，他回来的时候
Because
你要欢迎他，
he almost died coming to serve
因
me.
为他几乎死了，为了要
And
服
so
侍
he
我。
was trying to raise this young man up
希
in
望他
their
们可以
eyes.
看到他的眼光，他们的眼光里面可以很尊敬。
And maybe it's because
以巴弗提
Epaphroditus felt bad about himself
可能
and
以巴
what
弗
he.
提也觉得很难过，没有办法服侍
So
保
those are
罗。
kind of simple reasons why he wrote
这
the
是一
letter.
些简单的理由，为什么
But
这写
there
这
are
封
also
信。
some deeper reasons.
可是也有一些比较深奥的。
Things that Paul wanted to accomplish in this letter.
我想保罗想要在这封书信里面
And
想要成就的，
One of the main threads that runs throughout this whole letter
在这封信整封信里面，你可以看到一条线，
is Paul writing to the Philippians
就是保罗写给腓立比，
and giving them the idea that they are citizens of another kingdom.
就是他们是另外一个国度的国民，
And that this citizenship of another kingdom should guide them in life.
还有因为他们是另外一个国度的国民，所以这个身份应该带领他们一生一切的事。
What do we know about the people of Philippi?
我们知道什么有关腓立比的
They were
人？
proud of their
他
citizenship.
们是以他们的国民都是以他为荣，
They were proud of their
以
culture.
他们的文化为国民
They,
为
they,
荣。
they viewed their citizenship as being highly
他
exalted.
们觉得哇，我们这个是做罗马帝国的，这是最高的。
And Paul is explaining to them that there is another citizenship that they have that is even greater
可是现
than
在
a
保
Roman
罗他就
citizenship.
跟他们说，有另外一种国民比罗马国民还要高等，
And that this citizenship should guide their thinking.
还有这个新的，你属于这个新的，你是这个新的国度的国民，这个要引导你们一切的思
It
想，
should guide their
你
values.
们的价值观，
It should guide their character.
你们的品格应该因为这个不一样，
It should guide their
你们
actions.
的所有的行为
It
也是
should guide-
因为这个不一样，
It should guide their
你们的
responses.
所有的回应，
It should guide their views.
还有他们的眼光。
So Paul was trying to get the Philippians to see something,
所以保罗试着让腓立比人看一些事情，
to encourage them
鼓励他们
that，they should no longer view their lives through Roman culture
他们不要再看他们的生命就是经过罗马文化
or
的
Roman
眼光
thinking,
还是罗马的思想来看
the world's values,
世界的价值观，
but they need to view their lives through God's kingdom
他们要
culture.
从天国文化来看他们的生命，
Kingdom thinking,
就是要神国度的思想，
kingdom values.
神国度的价
And
值
you're。going to see this throughout the
后来
letter.
你们在这里就可以看到这个，
Romans 3:20 then is a key verse.
所以腓立比书
Not,
第三章，
not Romans, Philippians.
腓立比书第三章第20节。
It says, For our citizenship is in heaven, from which also we eagerly wait for a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ.
我们却是天上的国民，并且等候救主，就是主耶稣基督从天上降临。
This is a big point that Paul is
所
trying
以这个是
to
保
make.
罗在腓立比书很大的一个重点。
I know you're proud of your
我
citizenship.
觉得你以你们的罗马的为荣，
Our citizenship is in heaven.
可是我们是真的是我们是天上的国民，
Heaven's ways, kingdom ways are different from the
So-
world's ways.
天国的文化是跟世界的文化
So
不
when
一
you
样。
look through Philippians,
所以你看到腓立比书的时候，
you're going to see 6, maybe 7, I don't know,
可能你会
main
看6个还是7
main
个
areas where Paul is saying, hey, this is how God's kingdom is different from the world's kingdoms.
这是神国的思想眼光是跟世界的眼光不一样。
That's what you're going to be looking for when you teach.
我想你们在教导的时候会注意到这些，
Getting a new view of what life is really all about.
可以有一个新的眼光，是人生的一切的是什么？
So you see Paul saying, I want you to get a new view of this, I want you to
我
get
要
a
你
new
有
view
新的
of
眼
this,
光，这
a
个
new view
这
of
个
this.
这个
It's a powerful book.
是非常强有力的一卷书。
And again, Paul loved these people.
保罗很深爱这
You
些
can
人，
just see the relationship he has with them.
我们看到他跟他们有的这个关系，
But he wants to lift them up
可是要提高他们，
because he knows that there's only peace when they're living according to God's
因为他知
kingdom
道
ways
真
and
正的
thinking.
平安就是要他们按照神国度的方式来生活。
Our citizenship is in heaven.
我们是天上的国民，
Our citizenship is in heaven.
我们是天上的国民。
Yeah, but we're Roman citizens.
可是我们是罗马帝国的国民，
We're Taiwan
我们是
citizens.
台湾的国民了，
We're Danish
我们是
citizens.
丹麦国民了。
No,
没有
you're
没有，
citizens of heaven.
你是天上的国民，
That's far,
这个
far
大大
different.
的超过任何其他的国民。
That's what Paul's letter is
这是
about.
保罗的书信，就是在这里了。
Yeah.